All right, so I want to welcome all of you to our PolarConnect event. Today we're very excited to be joining Karen and the research team that is based out of Healy, Alaska. They're going to be discussing carbon balance in a warming and drying tundra. Today is August 11th, 2016. I'm your host today. This is Janet Warburton with ARCUS, and I'm working with Judy. And if you have any questions as they come along or technical issues, feel free to use the public chat area and let us know what's going on, and we'll try to resolve the issue. Before we get started with the presentation, there's just a few things we want to share with you. One of them is about this platform. If you've joined us virtually today, I did hear a couple of beeps, so I'm assuming some other people have joined by phone. The presentation slides will be changing in the middle. There is a chat. There's some files. Well, actually, today there's just links. There's a list of participants, and we are fortunate to have a webcam of the research team today. This will just be a one-way cam. It will be them sharing their faces and talking to us. We won't be using your own webcams if you have them available. This event is being archived, and we'll share with you, we'll post it online and send it out in an email to everybody that's registered in a day or two. This is already happening. It's participant introductions. If you have chat available and can see the chat window, please type in where you're from and who's joining us. And another thing is, if you are joining by phone, you can *6 to mute your phone and *6 to unmute it so that we don't get any background noise while the presenters are talking. And if you have joined us by voice over IP, you might have discovered at the top of the screen above the participant introductions, there is a little microphone. If you pull down the menu there or click on it, you can mute and unmute your microphone. And we hope that most people will mute their microphones. That way we don't get any feedback through the computers. So before I turn it over, just a little bit about why Karen is in Healy and enjoying a wonderful summer in Alaska. It's because she's part of a PolarTREC program. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, and the goal of our program is to place teachers with researchers like Marguerite in the field, and they get hands-on experiences. The nonprofit that Judy and I work for, the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, our mission is to really connect researchers with the public and with the communities that they work in, as well as educators. And so PolarTREC is just one of the many things that ARCUS does, but it's a really exciting program, and we've been doing it for a while, and we're really excited to have teachers like Karen working with scientists and taking that back home with them and into their careers. As we go along, if you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat area. And at the end, we're hoping that we'll be able to ask some live questions. We'll tell you how that works again as we get closer to the end. But for my part, that's all I've got to say. And at this point, we could turn it over to Karen and have her introduce herself and the team. So Karen, it's all for you.
Thank you, Janet and Judy, and all the rest of the ARCUS team for helping me get here. So my name is Karen Temple-Beamish. I am a science teacher at Albuquerque Academy here in beautiful Healy, Alaska, joined by a team of wonderful women and men. The people who are going to be helping me present today are Marguerite Maurice and Megan Taylor from SURE Lab, which is the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society at Northern Arizona University. Say hello, girl.
Hi.
So today we're going to be talking about carbon cycling in the Arctic and understanding the effects of permafrost thaw. The image in front of you is a picture I took from one of the research sites, and in the background you can see the beautiful Mount Denali, which I've been told is a pretty rare event to see it because it's usually covered in cloud. And I got a beautiful presentation of this mountain. Please move to the next slide. So Marguerite and Megan are part of a team of 6 of us this summer. I'm down there in the right-hand corner, standing next to the beautiful cabin that I get to stay in. Above me are Michael Durek, who is a recent grad of geology program at University of Michigan. Next to him is Justin Ledman, who's the field technician that lives here all year round. And next to him is Megan Taylor, a postdoc. And on the left-hand side of the screen is Marguerite Maurice, who's been here several years, and also a postdoc. And then we have Emily Romano, who is a first-year doctoral student at NAU. Next slide.
So Karen, go ahead, Jen. Karen, yeah, we have a request for you to turn up your volume or talk maybe more direct into the speaker. It could be also a bandwidth issue on your end, so if we start having volume issues, we'll probably turn off your webcam, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Okay, I'll try speaking louder, and we just turned it up as well. So,
okay,
where are we? We are in Healy, near Healy, Alaska, and you can see on the screen that Healy is a little bit south of Fairbanks, about half an hour away from Denali National Park. And the insert that you can see there is the research site, and we actually have 2 research sites. One's called CIPEHR, that's represented by the red star on the screen, and then another, I don't know how to turn that sound off, but another site is called Gradient, and that's represented by the black dot. And you can see there's a very large lake there. It's called 8 Mile Lake, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see Marguerite moving along a boardwalk with some equipment. The boardwalk is there to protect the tundra from constant impact of human traffic walking along the tundra. Next slide, please. So, as you can tell from the title of our presentation, we're interested in the carbon cycling in the Arctic and the impacts of permafrost, the warming of the planet and the impacts of permafrost. So I thought it'd be a good idea to just review the global carbon cycle. So in front of you, you have some round circles, and the numbers represent the numbers of billions of tons of carbon in each of those spheres. And it's important to understand that carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, but also methane, has been rising since the Industrial Revolution to over 400 parts per million. And the reason this is happening is because we have been impacting the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuel and deforestation, as well as agricultural practices, pumping a lot of the methane and the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So plants on our planet act to remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis, and then animals and microbes return this carbon back to the atmosphere in the form of methane and carbon dioxide. So you can see that the land, plants, and soil have a fairly significant amount of carbon stored there, and a subset of that is the permafrost soils, which is a very significant amount, and if it is locked up, doesn't return carbon to the atmosphere when it's frozen. So we're really concerned about what happens to the carbon if and when, well, we know it's happening, when this permafrost begins to melt. Next slide, please. So as I said, the Arctic is warming pretty rapidly as greenhouse gases increase. The atmosphere traps that infrared energy, that's radiated from the planet and warms the atmosphere. And we've got this graph can show you that in the Arctic regions, we're having an increase in temperature from 1960 to 2011 of about 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, which is much higher than in the temperate and tropical regions. Next slide, please. So why is it that we're worried? The Arctic stores a lot of carbon, as we saw from the previous slide. It's mostly frozen in the permafrost soil. And as the warmer temperatures happen, this can release a lot of carbon back into the atmosphere. However, we've also been observing that as the Arctic warms, it also becomes greener. There's more plant growth. Next slide, please. So what is permafrost? And I'm going to have Marguerite explain this to you.
Yeah, so this figure shows a few different features of permafrost, and mainly I want to point out the region that's marked as continuous permafrost and discontinuous permafrost, and then that layer that's called the active layer. So what happens in really, really cold regions of the Arctic, mostly at the really high latitudes in the north, the air temperatures are so cold that the ground everywhere is frozen. So that's a continuous permafrost zone. So anywhere you go on the landscape, you'll find frozen ground underneath you. And as you move further south and the air temperatures get warmer and warmer, the climate no longer supports as much permafrost and doesn't force all the ground to be frozen. And so you start to get these patchy, discontinuous permafrost zones where if you're at a slightly higher elevation, you might still have frozen soil, or if the vegetation can protect permafrost and can insulate the ground against warming, you can also get patches of permafrost. So permafrost is, across the landscape, is a pretty dynamic thing and varies a lot with latitude. And depending on where you are in that zone, thawing might happen more rapidly or more slowly. So you could imagine if you're in a zone of discontinuous permafrost where the permafrost is already patchy, much smaller temperature increases could lead to losses of permafrost in that area. And then the active layer is important because each year, even if you have permafrost that's down really, really deep in the soil, each year a little bit of that permafrost thaws in the surface layer of the soil because summer temperatures heat up and thaw that permafrost, and that's called the active layer. And that's basically the zone of the permafrost that becomes biologically active each year. And so that's a really important part of the biology and the carbon cycle. And one thing that we study a lot as a group is how, if that active layer gets deeper and deeper as the Arctic warms, how that will influence the carbon balance.
Thank you, Marguerite. Next slide. So here is a permafrost core sample, and on the left-hand side of the screen you can see that this core has mainly ice in it, and it comes from what we call an ice wedge. And then on the right-hand side, you see a core of permafrost that's been pulled out, and it's mostly organic matter that is undecomposed. Next slide, please. So what happens as the permafrost thaws? So as I mentioned, we have these greenhouse gases building up in our atmosphere, trapping more of the infrared energy that heats the atmosphere, and that heat is then transferred into the soil. As that heat is transferred, the nutrients that are in the organic matter become available, and also the carbon in the organic matter becomes available. Next slide, please. So as the nutrients become available, the plant roots take up those nutrients and are able to grow and photosynthesize more. Also, the carbon is now available to the microbes. As they digest it, they then release that carbon as CO2, or if there's a lack of oxygen, they'll release it as methane back into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So the research, the scientists want to know how much of this carbon is being released by microbial respiration and how much carbon is being removed from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And they also want to know how quickly is this going to happen. Next slide, please. So they want to measure the carbon flux. And so the title of this research is called CIPEHR, and that's short for Carbon in Permafrost Experimental Heating Research. And in this slide, you can see these chambers, and these chambers are essentially open to the atmosphere, and then you can see that at the top they have little lids that periodically close, and as they close, please move to the next slide. Oops, I forgot something. Let's back up a little bit. So, no, we can go to the next slide. Yes, definitely can go to the next slide. But let me explain what's happening. So remember, this is an experiment. We are trying to heat the tundra more rapidly so we can see what will happen in the future. And the way that we heat the tundra is to construct, at the end of the summer, these snow fences. And these snow fences act to trap the snow. As the air mass is moving over these snow fences, it flows and creates turbulence that allows the snow to settle out down onto the earth and pile up. And the snow acts as an insulator to prevent the tundra from getting colder. So we've got this artificial heating in this area. And so once spring arrives, it's really important for the researchers to get out there and remove that snow so that it doesn't introduce variables that they don't want to affect their data. So a week of heavy snow shifting happens in the late spring or early spring. So next slide, please. So now that the summer has arrived, what do the scientists do? By the way, that was a moose that I got to see from the car as we were driving to the research site. Next slide, please. So Megan is going to help me explain something about one of the things that the researchers want to do is they want to understand what the plants are doing. So they're going to go out and measure the amount of greenness that's on the landscape. So Megan, can you explain how they do that?
Sure. So we have a specialized camera that has a sensor that can capture multiple wavelength spectra that are reflected and absorbed by the vegetation in the field. And this gives us an index of greenness. And it's called a normalized differential vegetation index. And so essentially what the camera does is capture near-infrared radiation and reflected red and green color. And what you get from that is a picture like you see on the right where the color is different from what you would normally expect in a true color picture. And the pinkish colors are the near-infrared radiation. And so that is an index of greenness, and from that we can calculate essentially the health and biomass of the vegetation in the field.
Great, thank you. And I want those people from New Mexico to notice on Michael's shirt it says Lobos. So Michael, even though he graduated from the University of Michigan, is a New Mexican by heart, and so it was really fun to meet him, and he appreciated the green chili I brought up. So one of the other things that they do is they do some phenology studies, and this essentially means that they're out there counting the amount of blooms on a plant, and then later on in the season how many of these blooms have actually been pollinated and turn into fruits or berries. So I've been able to count blueberries and low bush cranberries, as well as, I call them salmon berries, but I think there's another common name for them as well. Next slide, please. So another thing that they need to know is, what is the carbon source? So Michael in the left-hand corner of the screen is setting up what are called force diffusion sensors, and these will be placed on the tundra to actually measure the microbial decomposition during the winter. In the lower left-hand corner, we've got Michael and Emily collecting water samples to understand the amount of carbon that's actually in the dissolved portion of the tundra, the water sample. And then on the right-hand side, we have Marguerite, who is measuring or collecting data for radiocarbon dating. And I'm going to let her explain briefly what that means.
Yeah, so one component of our lab's research that's fairly unique is that we do a lot of radiocarbon dating of the carbon that's being released from the soil. And so the reason we're interested in that the reason we're interested in that is because a lot of the carbon that's in the permafrost is very, very old because it's been accumulated for many years. And we want to know how much of the carbon that's coming out of the soil is this really old carbon, because that tells us something about how changing temperature, how changing permafrost thaw is affecting the overall carbon stocks, and tells us how vulnerable the permafrost is to decomposition with warming, and how much of the carbon that's being released is this really, really old stuff that's been stored and been stable there for many years and is now becoming unstable.
Great. Thank you, Marguerite. Next slide, please. So you can see that I've been used to help understand how deep the water table is in response to thawing, as well as how deep the permafrost is. And so it has been quite challenging for me to keep my balance while I'm walking and measuring these things out on the boardwalk. Next slide, please. So as I may have mentioned a little bit earlier in the talk, one of the things that they're doing is they're measuring the carbon flux. And so they have these plexiglass chambers that are about, I want to say, 1.5 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide. And they're placed on the tundra with the chambers open. And then they have these tubes, these blue tubes that are connected. And then periodically, the chambers are closed for about, what, a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes. And then the atmosphere within the chamber is pumped out through these blue tubes. Next slide, please. And they're connected to a computer, which then measures the amount of carbon dioxide in the chamber air. Next slide, please. So what does a carbon flux measurement look like? So in the upper graph, you can see that as the plants are more active, the CO2 is taken up by the plants, and so it starts to drop within the chamber. In the lower graph, you can see as the microbes are more active, the amount of CO2 begins to increase over time. Next slide, please. So was the system, the tundra, a net annual source or a net annual sink? And so that's kind of the gist of their research, is trying to figure that out. And I'm going to ask Marguerite to explain this bar graph for me.
Okay, so there's a lot going on in this figure. So what we have basically is the black bars. So Karen was describing to you how we measure carbon exchange in the summer. And so we take the whole summer season when we measure carbon exchange, and we look at all of the periods that we had carbon uptake, and we add that up. And we take all of the periods where we have carbon loss, and we take that and we add it up. And then we calculate what is the difference, and do we have more uptake or do we have more loss? And in the summertime, a positive number means that we had more uptake. So in this graph, you can see the white boxes. Those numbers and the position they are in the graph is each year, each summer, how much carbon uptake did we have on average from the experiment. And then the bars behind those white boxes are looking at the carbon losses during the winter time in years where we've been able to measure wintertime carbon loss. And here, so a black bar here, a positive number means a lot of carbon loss. So if you compare the black bars to the white boxes, you can see that in some years the white boxes are pretty low, so we have low carbon uptake in the summertime, and the losses in the winter highly exceed those summertime uptake periods, or that summertime uptake. And but in some years the summertime uptake actually exceeds the wintertime losses. So you can see that there's quite a lot of variation of whether or not the tundra over the full year is a source or a sink. And you can see in wintertime the bars, there's more losses from the treatments with the warmer soils where we have the snow fence pack. But from year to year, there's not really that much variability. It's fairly consistent. Whereas the white boxes, you can see, have been increasing through time in our experiment. And so what's been happening is that because of the disturbance and the nutrient release with the permafrost thaw, we've actually seen a lot of plant growth in our experiment. And in the first 5 years, that increased plant growth has started to store more carbon in the system, even though we're seeing also more winter losses. But this is just the first 5 years of the experiment. We don't have the full, the data from the most recent years. But in the most recent years, the plant growth has actually started to level off, and that summer uptake is beginning to drop. So we think that what we're seeing is an initial really strong response of the plants to the disturbance and the nutrient release from the permafrost thaw, and that is in the more recent years actually starting to level off, and that we're starting to see kind of we're starting to see continued release from the soil, but the plants are no longer able to grow because they've grown as much as they can.
Great, thank you, Marguerite. So next slide, please. So two of the data collections that I got to be a part of was depth to water table as well as depth to permafrost. So in the top graph, you can see that in 2009, when they began this experiment, the control, which is represented by the black line, the black dots, and the gray, sorry, I screwed that one up. The gray is the control, and the black is the heated site. You can see that the thaw depth is more or less equal. But as you move to the right, at 2015, we're still at the top, 2015, you can see that the depth to the permafrost has increased quite dramatically compared to the control site. In the bottom graph, this is depth to the water table. Again, in 2009, the control and the heated depths are more or less equal. And then as you move to 2015, you can see that the depth to the water table is quite shallow compared to the control site. Thank you. So next slide. So what I have learned a lot about the people that I'm working with is that they work really long hours and lots and lots of days. And however, they also enjoy the place that they live. And so they treated me to a beautiful hike near Denali National Park. We also went to a local bluegrass festival. And one of the day that we spent in town doing our errands and buying our food for the next couple of weeks, we also got to spend some time at the cultural center in Fairbanks. And each day that we work, we also eat really, really well. Each of us is responsible for creating a dinner, and so we have wonderful gourmet meals. And because of all the abundance of blueberries and raspberries, we make muffins and cobbler and hopefully a pie in the next couple of days. So we've been eating really well and enjoying each other's company. And I have to say it's been one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. So I want to thank all of my research scientist, and that's what I have. Please ask questions.
What kind of pie?
A blueberry pie.
So great presentation, ladies. Thanks so much. So if you want to ask some questions, feel free to type them in the chat or just somehow let us know that you want to ask your question live. There's a little hand icon you can click on at the, actually it's a little person, and you use that little pull-down menu and raise your hand, but just go ahead and let us know. Not a question Eileen wants to say, but just wanted to comment that I am so happy for you, Karen, that this has been such a wonderful experience.
Thanks, Eileen, for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you again.
All right. So anybody want to ask a question? How about the museum? Any questions from the museum or the Adams School? I know you guys have big group. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
We have a couple of questions. First, Dwight Jennison.
Okay, well, where are we then in estimating the total potential impact of Arctic methane? And can you say anything about the stability of the ocean calcrates?
Did you get that question?
Did you guys, I think so. Did you guys get that question, Karen and Marguerite?
No. Could you repeat the question, please?
You're talking too far up there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So where are we in estimating the total potential effect of the permafrost methane? And also, could you say anything about the stability of the ocean methane calcrates?
So I can't comment very much on methane calcrate stability because I really don't know anything about that, or not a lot. But in terms of permafrost contributions to methane, that's been the focus of a lot of recent work. So historically, a lot of the focus has been on carbon dioxide, and we've recently been focusing more on methane because methane is obviously a very important greenhouse gas, and methane is in many ways a lot more difficult than CO2 because it's more patchy in its production and a lot more variable. So it's something that a lot of people are trying to capture, and we're beginning to study at our site. But it's very much an active area of research trying to quantify exactly how much methane is being released from permafrost. We know that it's being released. We know that it's important, but we're trying to constrain exactly how much. There's a lot, yeah, and it's very, very much an active area of research trying to figure that out.
Thanks, Marguerite.
All right, excellent. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Another question from the museum. This is Malcolm Siegel. So in your experiment with the snow wall, it looks like you can show the effect of heating or increased temperature on the depth to the water table and the amount of thawing. But what does that tell you about the CO2 balance? Because it's not directly related to those two parameters.
Well, so the CO2 balance is related to those two parameters in the sense that deeper thaw means you have more potential soil contribution to CO2, to decomposition, and the water table is important because that controls how much oxygen you have available in the soil, and that is very important in determining whether you're going to have more methane or more CO2 production, and what the balance of those two will be. And so the figure that we showed with the carbon balance is a pretty coarse summary figure. But when we kind of break down the data a little bit more, looking at relationships between thaw and carbon uptake or thaw and carbon release, we see quite nice relationships between deeper thaw, we have more carbon release, and we also have more carbon uptake. And so it's kind of a little bit of a tricky thing because we see two responses. We see the responses of the plants and increased growth of the plants we also see the response of the increased decomposition and the increased carbon release. And that's one of the challenges with trying to understand the Arctic contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is understanding this balance. How much plant productivity, how much soil decomposition do we expect, and how will those two processes balance each other out? And the plants, in many cases, the plants respond more rapidly in the short term than the soil does. And so we do see these short-term periods of greater carbon uptake, but plants can only grow for so long because everything has kind of a maximum size that it can grow to. And the soil carbon pool is so incredibly large that we expect as the plants start to max out their growth and their activity, soil will continue to decompose, and at some point we're going to see a cross between the uptake and the decomposition and release processes. And so we're trying to understand when and how quickly that happens.
Quick question from the museum. Has someone been modeling the depth of thaw versus the temperature rise?
The temperature rise of the Arctic?
Yeah, the average temperature rise in the Arctic.
So we have not, but there are other groups that do that. Yes, there's a group at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks at the Geophysical Research Institute. It's a permafrost lab, and they do a lot of models and a lot of projections, trying to figure out, as the Arctic warms, what does that mean for permafrost temperatures, what does that mean for permafrost thaw, but it's not something that we do.
Thank you.
All right, great questions. So while you were responding to those, we got some questions coming in the chat. Socorro from the school there in Albuquerque would like to know how many people come from New Mexico and how you got there and if you get paid.
How did you get here and did we pay you?
So here's Michael.
Hey. So I actually grew up in New Mexico. And my family moved to Michigan when I was in about 5th grade. And Megan went to the same school as me. She did her PhD program at University of Michigan, and she emailed all the undergrads asking them, hey, there's this great job in Alaska, wants to come out here and work in Healy and study permafrost. And I replied, I'm like, oh, that sounds awesome. So that's actually how I got here. But
And do you get paid?
yeah, I get paid.
With blueberries?
And money.
And a little money.
Yeah.
Enough to do his laundry.
Yeah.
Nice. I love it. Yeah, doing laundry is always important. We have a question from Carly Trott. How many years is this project expected to last, and how many additional years?
So the warming manipulation has been going on for 7 years. And we actually have another site where we've been monitoring carbon fluxes without the manipulation, just kind of what's happening across the landscape. And that's been, that site has been active since 2004. It's kind of a constant cycle of trying to apply for funding and get more money to keep stuff going. So as long as we can get funding to keep the experiment going, we would like to keep it going. And Ted, the lab leader, he just submitted a proposal for an extra 10 years of funding to keep the experiment going so that we get a longer term time series, because as you can imagine, the Arctic things change so slowly. These long-term data sets are really important for us to understand what's going on. And so hopefully if we can continue to get funding, the experiment can continue till the money runs out.
Exciting. And I want to point out that Bruce Morakovic, up there, has been sharing some really good resources. And I don't know if he wants to come on and talk about what he's sharing, but there's a NOAA Arctic Change website that you can have a link to, and there was something earlier as well. He also shared the Coastal Blue carbon website that's being done in an estuarine environment. So Thank you for sharing those, Bruce. Any other questions out there that people want to ask live?
Another question from the museum.
Yes, my question
Excellent.
is, do your core samples go back more than 7 years? Or why did you choose to start at 2009?
Well, so like I said, we have this one site that's been where we've been monitoring since 2004, and there at that site we have a natural gradient of permafrost thaw that for some reason we don't know exactly why. There are some areas where the thaw is very shallow and some areas where the thaw is very deep. And the lab, this is way before I was part of the lab, had been observing some of the changes that we've been talking about: increased plant growth in the deeper thawed area, but also increased carbon release and a lot of old carbon being released from the deeper thaw areas. And one of the tricky things with a natural gradient is that you don't exactly know cause and effect, and it's really difficult to tease apart driving factors. And so after like 5 years of working at the gradient site, the lab applied for some money to do this, to get funding to do this manipulation, where we start in an area that's very uniform and the same in terms of thaw depth, and we impose these different warming treatments and see what changes in direct response to these warming treatments and how does that impact the carbon balance. And do we see patterns that are similar to what we're observing across the landscape? And so 2009 was just, you know, the time that was right in terms of what had already been published and in terms of being able to get funding to do this manipulation. So there's nothing magic about 2009. But in the manipulation is nice because we can draw some pretty clear sort of cause and effect. The only thing that we changed is the temperature of the soil and the temperature of the air around this little patch of tundra. What is that doing to the carbon fluxes? And we have been observing changes that seem to mirror what we see across the landscape.
Okay, great question. Anything else from the museum there? Since you guys have a big group there. Or school. I know there was somebody on the phone too. Feel free to interrupt us. Okay, museum, it looks like you're trying to talk or something. All right, well, we'll stand by for some more questions. In the meantime, I wanted to ask Karen, when are you heading home? And yeah, how much longer do you have?
So I will be heading home Wednesday evening. I'm taking an evening flight out, and so I'll be home on Thursday, and I get to start school on Monday. And so my students will already be starting their first day of school on Thursday, so I'll be absent for them, but I have a wonderful substitute stepping in for me. So they'll get to learn all about the Arctic and my experience once I get home.
Excellent. Yeah, it's crazy. Your time is already coming to an end and school's already starting. Insane. So it looks like we do have another question from the school there in Albuquerque. Looks like they looked at the NOAA's link and they want to know why it's so hot. And I'm not really sure. Oh, hot around the globe. So they probably, on that link, I haven't seen it, but they probably have that map that you two might be familiar with, where it just kind of shows the whole world is basically heating up. And I will try to go there if I can.
So do you mean like, so I think what that link is showing 2015 compared to the long-term trends and kind of the record hot temperatures in 2015?
Yeah, it probably is. I think it's that global, there's that global map that just shows that everything in the world is warming up over time. And yeah, it's just a bunch of red and orange for the most part. And I can't, I don't want to take people away from this thing. So I think the question is probably why is the world so hot? What's happening? And if you feel like you can, what is it with global warming, and why is the whole world showing heat? Oh yeah, there you go. You actually have it in your picture.
Yeah.
Let me go to.
Well, I mean, the overall global warming, that's the increases in greenhouse gas emissions and the increased greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, and that's sort of the long-term trajectory that the relatively short-term trajectory that we've been on for the last 100 years or so. And less than that. And the most recent years, I'm not entirely sure exactly why, but in terms of the Arctic, the last 7 years have been record hot years. I mean, that fits the trend that we're afraid of, this rapid warming of the globe. And then the last 2 years, 2015, 2014, this year as well, have been really record high. Each year is a hotter year than the previous year, average global temperatures. Again, that's those are the effects that we are seeing in response to increasing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing increased heat storage on the globe.
Okay, yep, you nailed it. We all got on track there, so thank you. There was a question, well, Adam's typing away there. There was a question somewhere up here by Julia. She wants to know, I have a small question. Do you plan to use any techniques besides chambers for measuring carbon flux?
So we do already use some other techniques at the thaw gradient site where we're monitoring. We have a tower where we're measuring fluxes kind of at the wider landscape scale. So we have an eddy flux tower is what that's called. That doesn't really work for this manipulation because the manipulation, we're looking at very small scale things, but our monitoring site is at the larger landscape scale. So we use that. And then we have a few other sensors. Karen showed a picture with Michael with the force diffusion sensors. That's like a miniature chamber that sits on the soil that can measure carbon release from the soil, respiration, and decomposition. So we have a few different tools that we use.
Okay, great. Let's see. What else we got here? All right, so so they understand there at the Albuquerque School that a lot of what is causing the global temperature change is unknown. That's what they got out of your response there.
Well, I mean, not unknown in the sense that we know that it's increases in greenhouse gas concentrations. We know that increased CO2 and methane emissions to the atmosphere cause warming. Exactly why the 2 years have been so record-breaking hot, I think that is not entirely clear. But the general trajectory and that general trend of increasing temperatures, that certainly is well understood.
Okay. Anybody else have questions here? These are excellent questions, and I'm just going through the chat so we can see.
We have one more question from the museum.
Yes,
okay.
3 years ago, I was about 100 miles south of the Arctic Ocean, and we had looked at the depth of the permafrost, and it was approximately 1.5 inches. Did you choose Healy because it had a faster rate of permafrost loss, or are you doing any comparisons to more northern areas, because it's as hot up in those northern areas as it is down near Fairbanks now, I know?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Yes, one of the reasons we are working near Healy is because we're in the discontinuous permafrost zone, and that's where we expect changes to happen very rapidly, and we expect that the changes that we're observing here will act next as a forecast for what will happen much further north, where the permafrost is still a lot more stable than it is in these more southern latitudes. And then another big reason for why we're working here is that there's a long-term record of permafrost temperatures that was started in the 70s, where the people who were measuring deep permafrost temperatures have been observing a steady increase in permafrost temperature and kind of a steady destabilization of the permafrost. And so we wanted to build this carbon observatory on top of that existing record of permafrost temperatures so that the two things can be related to each other. Do we do comparisons with the more northern or colder permafrost zones? Not directly, although Ted, the PI of the lab, he's part of something called the Permafrost Carbon Network, which is a bigger network of scientists that work all over the Arctic region, and they pull together a lot of different data sets to try and do comparisons and get a larger picture understanding of carbon balance in the Arctic as a whole.
All right, and we have two questions that's related to what you were just talking about there, Marguerite. There's a question about what is discontinuous permafrost? And then the next question from the school is, why is methane and carbon dioxide called greenhouse gases? They have a greenhouse.
So I can answer the greenhouse gas question. So you probably have a greenhouse near you, maybe in your own school or in your house, and the sunlight, the visible light, comes in through the greenhouse, through the pane of glass, comes in unabsorbed, and then the plants will absorb that sunlight energy and then release some of that sunlight, that visible light energy, as infrared. And the infrared energy gets blocked by the glass, and so it stays, that infrared energy stays within the greenhouse for a time. So a greenhouse gas is one that absorbs infrared energy and then slowly releases it back to the atmosphere. And then another greenhouse gas might then absorb some of that infrared energy that's released. So the heat or infrared energy stays within the atmosphere, kind of like a blanket holds that energy inside the atmosphere for a time. And then the other question was about discontinuous permafrost, and so I'm going to let Marguerite answer that.
So there was one figure that was a kind of a cross-section through permafrost. So discontinuous permafrost is basically an area where you are, where it's maybe where you have permafrost, where the permafrost is patchy across the landscape. So you might have some spots on the landscape where there's no permafrost, and you have other patches on the landscape that do have permafrost. And the reason that you get this patchy permafrost is it could be that there used to be a climate in that zone that had promoted permafrost everywhere, and as it got warmer, some of that permafrost got lost and some of it remained. And so you start to get this sort of patchwork of permafrost. And in discontinuous permafrost zones, the air temperatures are kind of hovering on the brink of where permafrost can be stable. And if it continues to get warmer in that area, then you might not be able to support any permafrost. But if it was to get a little bit colder, you could reform permafrost in some areas. So discontinuous permafrost refers to this sort of transition zone from a region that's really, really cold where there's permafrost everywhere to a region where it's so warm that you no longer have any permafrost.
Excellent questions and responses. So there's another question from the school there in Albuquerque. Isn't the ozone layer what affects how much heat we get?
So no, the ozone layer is a separate phenomenon, and often my students will confuse ozone layer and ozone depletion with greenhouse gases. One confusion is probably because some of the chemicals that we release into the atmosphere, which we know cause ozone depletion, are also greenhouse gases. They're called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. So that may be where the area of confusion is. The ozone layer does not have any really anything to do with global warming.
Okay. There was another question from Julia. What is the difference between discontinuous and sporadic permafrost? And you might have already kind of responded to that, but go ahead.
That's a really good question, and I don't know. I'm going to look that up. It might just be two different words for the same thing, or they might actually be different things. And yeah, honestly, I'm going to have to look that up.
All right, that's a good one for to relay to Karen in a journal or something too as well. So, okay, I think, let's see. Oh, we have Marcus. Welcome, Marcus. So you got a person from Switzerland. I'll just let you know where he's calling in from today. What do you think? Have we passed already a certain tipping point concerning permafrost in the Arctic? How would you define such a tipping point? And concerning sea ice, have we already passed such a point of no return? I'll let you digest that one.
You can tell that this is a tough question.
I mean, I would have to say I don't know. Tipping points are very difficult to define and determine. I think it depends a lot on what the future trajectory is in terms of warming of the region or of the planet, because it very much depends on what happens in the future. If we continue to warm at the rate that we're warming, then there's probably a point. Then we're probably at a point of no return. If there are things that can be done to slow the rate of warming, then perhaps carbon release from permafrost will also be slower. It's kind of the two things are related. Whether or not we've reached a tipping point in terms of a kind of a global warming tipping point, and can we do something now to reduce our CO2 emissions that will prevent further warming or as much warming as we've been seeing in the past years? That's also a question that's kind of very debated by scientists at the moment. Some people say that no, like a lot of policy makers and politicians talk about a 2-degree warming target, and many people say that we can achieve that if we very rapidly change our carbon release habits and really decarbonize our economies and release less carbon into the atmosphere. And some people say that no, we've actually probably already surpassed some of those tipping points, and 2 degrees of warming we're pretty set on that trajectory no matter what we do, but we can affect warming beyond the 2 degrees, but the 2 degrees is baked in. So that it's definitely a tricky question to answer. I think there is consensus that continued carbon emissions will continue our warming trajectory. If we reduce our carbon emissions, we can slow the rate of warming. But the tipping points, yeah, that's a tough one.
And I would like to add that one of the things that I like to focus on in my classroom is using the soil system to actually absorb a great deal of that carbon. There has been 40 years of study by the Rodale Institute that proves that organic farming techniques and better health of the soil system can actually take up a lot of that CO2. So I believe that there are things that we can do to prevent catastrophic problems with the climate, but we have to start now. We have to start educating our students and applying some of these agricultural practices as well as other technology solutions as quickly as possible.
Yeah, this is Janet from Arcus, and I'd just like to add, I added it in the comments that, it may be that, we can't stop things from warming, or that it might not make as big of an impact by changing some of our immediate actions. But I think the other message is that things are changing. We don't know all the answers to how or why they're changing or what it's going to look like for us, but that's not a reason to give up on hope, and that we do all have a role in both educating ourselves as well as others about the changes, and also learning how to prepare and adapt for them. And that can be come in lots of different shapes and forms, and there's a lot of great resources out there about how to things that you can do as an individual or as a community to mitigate some of these unforeseeable things that are coming our way. And I think it's important as educators and people that work in climate change to not give young people or people in general a sense of lack of hope for the future, because it certainly is hopeful. Humans are very adaptable, and our planet is certainly adaptable. So it's just us working together for the better of our world, and just trying to make the best of what we're doing and learn from what we've already done to our planet.
Thank you, Janet. That's really important for the young people to understand and know that there is hope and that we can work together. That's my experience as a teacher and as an appreciator and lover of this planet, that there's lots of positive, wonderful things that are being done by people all over the planet.
All right. So, go ahead, Marguerite. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, sort of from a permafrost point of view, one of the reasons that this is kind of such a hot topic at the moment is because up until about the last 10 to 7 years, we've really begun to appreciate how much carbon is stored in permafrost. It's not something that we really knew about before. And so permafrost has not really been included in a lot of our climate models and our projections and predictions for how interaction between between plants and soil and the atmosphere is going to affect the climate. And so that's a really important thing to understand, is that we didn't know that the permafrost was there. We haven't really included it in our calculations. So one really important thing is just to understand these unknown components so that we can have a fuller appreciation for how different factors are going to interact with climate change and with global warming and greenhouse gases, and what that means in terms of what kind of policies are feasible and what kind of policies we need to implement to change anything or to do anything. So it's kind of understanding this unknown, because this permafrost carbon pool is a really new thing in our understanding of Earth dynamics.
Excellent. Yeah, it's great that your research is going to be continued to be funding, because as you said, it's you don't have all the answers, and there's still much more to learn. All right, I think, we've gone past our hour here, so if people have more questions, we're going to have you direct them to the website, and you can post them in as comments to the journals directly to Karen, and she can relay them and work with the research team to respond to those questions. And yeah, I just love this photo too. I'm glad that you guys got to see the mountain, as I know that it was scarce this summer. Anyway, I'm going to be stopping the recording here in a moment, but before I do, I just wanted to say thank you all very much for joining us. We will be archiving this, and if you, before you all sign off, we'd like you to take a moment and kind of rate your experience in this PolarConnect event. And sorry, I kind of turned off the webcam there for you, for Karen and Marguerite. But again, thank you both for, and the rest of the team for joining us today. It was great.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Yeah. And you guys can stay on for a little bit if you want to while people check out. And let me stop the recording.